Morning.
Right.
Countdown. You
Good
ready?
morning, or good afternoon, or good evening for everyone, wherever you're located. Before this hearing begins, I'd like to pass along some notes about the system we are using today. This hearing will be broadcast live on the committee's website beginning in a moment. Each participant has a control bar at the bottom of their screen that includes a mute button and a video on-off button. The view control buttons in the upper right of your screen control your personal view and can be switched between active speaker, active speaker with thumbnails, and grid view. This is your individual view and will not affect anyone else or what the public sees during the proceeding. Please note that the
Everyone,
system's
can you hear me?
active speaker view will automatically switch to your camera a few moments after you begin speaking. You will also notice that in the grid view, one of the participants is a timer. This will be used to keep time for testimony and
Hello.
questions.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Pete.
Yep. I will recommend that when asking questions or testifying that you use grid view so that you can see the timer. Documents for the committee record can be emailed to chadocuments@mel.house.gov. Members can see these documents as they are submitted by refreshing the box link provided to you earlier. In a moment, I will mute all participants other than Chairperson Fudge. All participants are asked to keep themselves muted when not actively engaging in the discussion, which should help limit echoes or other disruptions. In instances in which members yield back or otherwise conclude their turn speaking but do not remember to remute themselves, I will do so to limit inadvertent background audio. Members and witnesses are responsible for unmuting themselves anytime they wish to be heard. With that, we are ready to begin. Chairperson Fudge, please count down from 7 so that the system displays your video. Pause briefly while the stream begins and then start the proceeding.
Thank you. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will come to order. I see my colleagues from the committee, Mr. Davis, thank you so much. Mr. Aguilar, and I do understand that Mr. Butterfield is joining us shortly. I want to thank my colleagues who are witnesses on this panel as well. Thank you so much for being here today for this virtual subcommittee hearing. As we begin, I want to remind our members and participants of a few things that will help us navigate this new platform. We are holding this hearing in compliance with regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965. The fundamental nature of the hearing and our rules are unchanged. Generally, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members will need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Witnesses will need to unmute themselves when recognized for their 5 minutes or when answering a question.
He's right. Oh, there he is. He's there.
Who's talking? I'm not sure who that is. Members and witnesses, please keep your camera on at all times. Even if you need to step away for a moment during the proceedings, do not leave the meeting. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and that any written statements be made part of the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Now we turn to today's important topic. On a morning when we are discussing voting, we note that this is our first hearing on voting since the passing of our dear friend and colleague, the Honorable John Robert Lewis. Congressman Lewis spent his life and career fighting for the right of every American to have free and fair access to the ballot. We must and will continue that work. Today, we will examine the issues of voting rights and election administration in the territories of the United States. This committee is tasked with oversight of federal elections. This must include oversight of how federal elections are administered in the U.S. territories, the impact of federal laws on elections in the territories, and investigating barriers to the ballot box. During the many hearings held by the committee and subcommittee throughout the 116th Congress, we have explored issues of election administration, election security, voting rights and access, and protecting the integrity of our democracy. It is past time we include voting in the U.S. territories in this examination. And I thank Ms. Plaskett for asking that we do this some time ago. Collectively, the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, in in the Atlantic, and Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in the Pacific constitute the 5 inhabited territories of the United States. Nearly 4 million people live in the territories. These are our fellow Americans. They have suffered significant devastation in recent years from hurricanes and tropical cyclones. They are not immune from the impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Their residents serve in the armed services at a rate historically among the highest of any in the nation. Our examination of access to the ballot would be incomplete if we did not address access to the ballot in the U.S. territories. We are here today to listen to and learn from our colleagues, citizens, and litigators about the barriers to access to the ballot in the territories. I thank you all for being here. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. Each of you will be recognized. Oh, forgive me. Mr. Davis, would you like to make an opening comment?
Great to see everybody. Oh, I am unmuted. Sorry about that.
Yes, yes.
All right. Great to see everybody. And I do apologize for that. I want to say thanks to everybody here. Since the creation of the Committee on House Administration, oversight of federal elections quickly became one of its chief tasks. Throughout the CHA's existence, the committee has worked across the aisle to create significant and necessary election policy that has widely impacted this nation, including legislation to eliminate the poll tax, legislation to create easier access to members of the military and their families when voting overseas, and the Help America Vote Act, a landmark piece of legislation that took significant steps to remedy the problems seen in the 2000 presidential election. The Subcommittee on Elections is designed to serve as an extension of the CHA to enhance oversight capabilities of federal elections. While the subcommittee has not always been a formal part of CHA, the work on election administration has always remained a top priority. And this priority should not be a partisan one. Hearing from the people who actually conduct elections and the problems they face is vital to our work on this subcommittee. That's why in the past, I've invited my own local election administrator, who is a Democrat, to testify in front of the full House Admin Committee, and had my staff reach out to the Virgin Islands Elections Administrator, Ms. Caroline Fox. After it was brought to our attention, she was not contacted ahead of time about this hearing to hear what her concerns are. I'm glad she was able to submit written testimony for the record today. We must work in conjunction with election officials and include them in hearings like this. I'm sorry to see Mr. Abramson is sick. I was looking forward to his perspective. While expanding voting rights is a noble and just cause, we are less than 100 days until states and localities will be conducting a presidential election in the middle of a global pandemic, something not done in my lifetime. However, during recent primaries, we did get a glimpse of the many problems that can occur if steps are not taken to properly prepare election administrators and voters. This committee should be providing oversight of states and localities who run our elections by engaging with localities where we saw significant issues in recent primaries and where the risk of disenfranchising voters is great if changes are not made before November. Just last week, I sent letters to 10 different localities across the country seeking information regarding issues reported in recent primaries and other election administration violations. State and local election officials are moving quickly to adapt to running elections during this pandemic, and I want to make sure we're providing them the help and guidance they need to run a successful election this fall. I want to make sure we're avoiding some of the issues we saw prior to the adoption of the Voting Rights Act: consolidation of polling locations, confusion among voters on their proper polling location, and long lines on election days. Nevertheless, we're here today to explore voting rights and election administration in the territories. I certainly wished we would have had this one in person, but unfortunately the pandemic took care of that. And I do want to thank my good friend and former seatmate on the House Ag Committee, Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett from the Virgin Islands, Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon from Puerto Rico, Congressman San Nicolas from Guam, and Congressman Sablan from the Mariana Islands for their testimony they're about to give today. I've enjoyed the opportunity to work with each of you. There are 5 inhabited unincorporated territories of the United States: American Samoa, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Virgin Islands. Each of these territories have contributed in countless ways to the American fabric. For instance, the rate of military service from these territories is traditionally much higher than the mainland average. Their cultures make America better. However, they do not have voting representation in the United States Congress. Underlying this status are numerous court decisions, some recent, some antiquated. Today, I'm here to listen to all the witnesses who have graciously agreed to participate in this virtual hearing, and I look forward to hearing what you have to share with the subcommittee. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Davis. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes. I will remind our witnesses that the entire written statements will be made a part of the record, and that the record I've got this from you, Rodney, will remain open for at least 5 days for additional materials to be submitted. A reminder to all our witnesses, there is a timer on the screen. Please be sure you can see the timer and are mindful of the 5-minute time limit. Our first panel, we will hear from 4 of our colleagues, each of whom represent residents of the territories. As is custom, we will not ask our colleagues questions. Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, my good friend, represents the United States Virgin Islands at-large congressional district. She currently serves on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and the House Committee on Agriculture, where she chairs the subcommittee on biotechnology, horticulture, and research. Prior to serving in Congress, Representative Plaskett served as an assistant district attorney in the Bronx, a senior counsel at the Department of Justice, and as general counsel for the Virgin Islands Economic Development Authority. Welcome, Ms. Plaskett. Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon was elected in 2016 as Puerto Rico's sole representative to the Congress, known as a resident commissioner. She is the first woman to hold the office. She is a member of the House Committees on Transportation and Infrastructure and Natural Resources. She previously served in the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, where she served as Speaker of the House and Minority Leader. Welcome. Congressman Michael San Nicolas represents Guam in the 116th Congress. Before coming to Congress in 2019, Congressman San Nicolas served in the Guam legislature since 2013. He currently serves as Vice Chair of the House Financial Services Committee and serves on the Natural Resources Committee. Welcome to you. And lastly, Congressman Gregorio Kilili Camacho Sablan is the first and only person to represent the people of the Northern Mariana Islands in the House of Representatives, beginning service in 2009, my classmate. He currently serves as chair of the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary and Secondary Education of the Education and Labor Committee, as well as on the Natural Resources and Veterans Affairs Committees. Prior to serving in Congress, Congressman Sablan served in the Northern Mariana Islands legislature in the administration of several governors and was appointed executive director of the Commonwealth Election Commission. I now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes. Ms. Plaskett, you are recognized.
Good morning, Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, fellow members of Congress, distinguished guests. My name is Stacey Plaskett, and I represent the Virgin Islands of the United States in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you so much for this hearing. One cannot discuss voting rights and disenfranchisement in the territories without talking about race and racism. The unincorporated territories of the Virgin Islands of the United States, a possession, is the most structural example of systemic racism. That system permeates the legal status as well as the economic, political, and educational structure that keeps the disparity between us and the mainland. It manifests itself as a position of exclusion of the people living in the Virgin Islands from equitable treatment. 103 years ago, the Danish government sold what is now known as the Virgin Islands, land, waters, property, and as part of the package, people. All four of my grandparents were alive and living on the island of St. Croix at the time of the transfer. Of my 8 great-grandparents, I believe one may have met the land and income requirement mandatory to be able to vote on the purchase. Only one would have been able to vote for his destiny. And after the purchase, those living in the territory, my grandparents and great-grandparents, my family, were citizens of nowhere. They had no citizenship for 10 years. After becoming citizens, Virgin Islanders came to Washington and petitioned, pleaded for the ability to be part of the draft. Virgin Islanders, like the other territories, serve and give the ultimate sacrifice in far greater number per capita than those Americans on the mainland. We want the responsibility, not just the privileges. This is a long-standing absurdity in our current legal system. Nearly 4 million Americans live on American soil and cannot fully participate in our democracy. They can only if they leave home. So long as they reside on the Virgin Islands soil, on US soil, mainland soil, they can vote for president. But when they move to a territory, their voting rights disappear. As you all know, the territories also does not have equal voting representation in Congress. In recent history, they have occasionally had similar rights in the US House of Representatives in the event that it resolves itself in the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for consideration of amendments to legislation, so long as the territories' vote won't actually make a difference. Do you know what it's like to see a bill related to your people, your constituents, and not be able to vote on it? This lack of equal representation and equal voting power has a direct correlation to persistent poverty across all of the US territories. Americans living in the territories are accustomed to being last in line for hurricane relief, for COVID-19 equipment, for basic healthcare, education, and more. All 5 territories have significantly lower per capita income than any state, yet are subject to arbitrary eligibility barriers and funding caps that limit their poorest residents to much-needed federal benefits like Medicaid and SSI, as well as the formulas for roads and education and more. I submit that they would be much more likely to receive parity and equality under these programs if millions of Americans who live in the territories of the United States were allowed to participate fully in our democracy. At the core of the disenfranchisement of the territories is a series of controversial Supreme Court decisions written in the same period that the Virgin Islands became part of the United States, known as the Insular Cases. These cases held that the Constitution's rights and protections do not necessarily apply to Americans in the territories, nor do the promises of full political participation or equality. Those decisions were explicitly informed by racial assumptions. In one case, the court refused to extend equal constitutional guarantees in Puerto Rico because doing so would place an undesirable limit on the federal government's ability to rule over, quote, savages or, quote, alien races, not immersed in Anglo-Saxon principles of law. It comes as no surprise that the most influential of these cases, Down versus Bidwell, was decided by the same justices who invented separate but equal doctrine of racial segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson just 3 years earlier. Yet even as legal scholars have characterized the Insular Cases as central documents in the history of American racism, the last 3 administrations, Trump, Obama, and Bush, each have defended the Insular Cases, suggesting that outdated racial premises can and should remain the law of the land. Before the Insular Cases, territories were viewed as inchoate states, areas on the path to full statehood. The Insular Cases have created a near permanent colonial status for those living in the territory. When the House Parliamentarian and Congressional Research Service used the Insular Cases to opine on why the territories should not be given a full vote, the irony of the Insular Cases is that Virgin Islanders in the 1700s pooled money together to send a promising young man to the Americas. Alexander Hamilton, that young man, co-authored the Constitution, the same documents that keep us from this. I know that I've run out of time, but I would like to submit for the record written testimony from so many Virgin Islanders who have given me written testimony. They range across the spectrum from the head of our GOP, our Virgin Islands Republican Party, John Canagator, to Carolyn Fox, to Carol Burke, the Democratic National Committee woman, all administrations. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to listening to our witnesses as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. You need to unmute. Please unmute.
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for holding this hearing on voting rights and election administration in the territories. The rights to vote and to be equally represented in the governments that make one's laws and to have elections conducted fairly are the most fundamental and essential elements of democracy. So I need to support the statement of my friend Stacey Plaskett. We're fighting almost for the same thing. I represent about 89% of the total population in the 5 territories. That means that I represent 3.2 million American citizens with the same rights as American citizens in the States, but we and the residents of other territories live in jurisdictions that constitutionally cannot have votes in the government that not only makes our national laws, but can and sometimes does intervene in local laws. Congress has this power because of the Constitution Territorial Clause, which make Congress our super-territorial legislature. Congress can delegate the exercise of self-government to the people of a territory, but it still ultimately possesses the power to govern us in all matters, and it can take it back the self-government it has delegated. That's the reality. It did this in Puerto Rico in 2016 with the approval of PROMESA, and the Supreme Court subsequently reiterated the authority. It cannot relinquish the power without making a territory a state or a nation. It also constitutionally can, and does, treat us differently than the states, overall worse. These are the single most influential factors in Puerto Rico's economy under development. It is also why the Americans that I represent are not only 35% of all Puerto Ricans that live on the island. Approximately 5 million Puerto Ricans live in the US mainland because of the greater opportunity and rights available to them in a state which Puerto Rico cannot provide. The United States is history's greatest democracy, but it has never been a perfect democracy. The problem of democracy and equality for territories, however, cannot be rectified by Congress or the courts because it's come from the plain meaning of the Constitution. The only way for a territory to obtain voting representation in Congress, equal or otherwise, or in electing a president is to become a state or for the Constitution to be amended. We have seen this in the District of Columbia, obtaining votes in electing the president throughout a constitutional amendment. We have also seen it repeated court rulings rejecting claims that try to extend federal voting rights of states to citizens in territories. The only other option for territories to obtain democracy is to become nations, either fully independent from or in a free association with the United States or another nation that either nation can unilaterally end. This will mean the end of the US citizenship in one way or another. The same is true for obtaining equal treatment in federal programs. Even when we are granted equal treatment, it can be taken away. The situation that I have described is this hard truth for Americans in the territories. These realities and appreciation of admiration of the United States are why the remaining people of Puerto Rico want the territory to become a state. We should not have to move to an existing state for democracy or equality. That territories will eventually become states was a founding principle of our nation that dates to the Articles of Confederation and was reenacted during the first session of the first Congress. This policy was cast aside after the Spanish-American War in 1898 because of racial and cultural bigotry. There was a concern that if Puerto Rico were put in path of statehood, the Philippines would want that too. So the Supreme Court divined the existence of a previously unknown status, unincorporated territory, that status of being a possession but not part of the United States. Unincorporated territories have become can become nation as well as state. Only constitutional rights considered to be fundamental applied, absent action by Congress or the court. The Supreme Court has resisted all efforts to reverse its findings of this status, including very recently. Doing so will mean all territories can only become states. Whether other ones, it's for them to say. I can report that Puerto Rico does want to become a state of the Union, and it wants equality and democracy within the United States. And that's the reason we filed and dropped HR 4901 with 60 co-sponsors supporting statehood for Puerto Rico, including our friend John Lewis. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very, very much. Next, we will hear from Congressman Michael San Nicolas. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Fudge and Ranking Member Davis and our honorable members of the subcommittee, my name is Michael F. Q. San Nicolas, and I am the representative at large for the territory of Guam to the U.S. House of Representatives. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to the committee for taking the historic step to hold this hearing, as it encompasses a subject no less significant than the suffrage of this democracy of our United States. Today, the committee will be hearing testimony and receiving testimony from witnesses who will very eloquently articulate the circumstances of the subject before us, the voting rights of American citizens who reside in our U.S. territories. The committee will hear compelling arguments of the inequality and injustices that surround these circumstances, how it is fundamentally un-American, and how it is long overdue for remedy. For my part, in representing my constituency, the people of Guam, I first want to open in full agreement that the inability for American citizens to impact electorally the full voting representation they have in the Congress and the president of their country is a circumstance that must be addressed. Equally, as a non-voting member of this House, I also have the unique perspective to assert in full confidence that these present circumstances denying American citizens of the opportunity for full representation is not born out of malice from any member of this House. Plainly put, there is not a single member of Congress, to my knowledge, who relishes in the fact and seeks to perpetuate the reality that Americans anywhere, and in particular our territories, are disenfranchised. We are here today because the history of our country, the makeup of our republic, the framework of our Constitution, and the case law of our courts have not caught up to what we today would expect to be an American standard. That every American living in America should be equally protected and represented in the law as Americans. The challenge before us today is how to address this. History has shown that it was never the intent of this republic to perpetually maintain territories. Every American territory before 1898 had a very distinct path into the Union. And what was consistent in all paths was a deliberate attempt to invest in their eventual inclusion, whether it was through encouraging settlement or investing in infrastructure, or in the deliberate attempt by the predecessors of this body to take pride in growing the number of states that encompass the United States of America. Territories that qualify for full inclusion into the Republic as states must be so included. Puerto Rico must be included as a state in this Republic or released by this Republic. There is no rational basis to maintain it as a territory, as it meets all constitutional thresholds for inclusion, and the inaction of this government that perpetuates its territorial status is inexcusable. A binding referendum in Puerto Rico administered by the United States for inclusion of the state of Puerto Rico as a state or recognition of an independent Puerto Rico is a duty we have not the convenience to ignore. The very integrity of our republic is at stake. For our smaller territories, to include Guam, a deliberate attempt to bring them into the Union must be undertaken by this country. Further incremental progress must be taken in this regard to include the extension of delegates, not only to the United States House of Representatives as we have today, but to the United States Senate, that there may be some form of representation in both chambers of Congress. Similarly, Electoral College representation, as so extended to the District of Columbia, must so too be extended to all territories. While the latter represents a larger hurdle requiring a constitutional amendment, the former could have us seating Senate delegates post haste, as legislation in my HR 5526 introduced in this 116th Congress would see it so. Additional consideration must be given to territories to enhance their abilities to qualify for inclusion as states. Deregulation of shipping constraints to lower the cost of living, travel waivers to encourage tourism growth, public transportation infrastructure investment to mobilize economies, and higher education investment to firm up local governments and enterprise are all modern-day equivalents of the same policies that transformed the West and the Midwest into the great states west of the Mississippi that we have in our union today. A deliberate attempt to meet their unique needs and circumstances in order to fuel their growth into full membership and the fulfillment of full voting rights for those who call them home is something that we need to support for our territories. The quest for voting rights in this republic and how we address it is nothing less than a testament of this government's commitment to this republic, to growing it, strengthening it, and also graduating its territories into whole parts of it, or setting them free, and preserving this republic from bastardization. This is the question before us, the sanctity of American democracy. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to working with you and all the great representatives of this Congress to address these truths as they are now known and our commitment to it. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Gregorio Kilili Camacho Sablan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding today's hearing. I wish to associate myself with the statements, including the discussion of the legal hurdles of allowing citizens of territories to fully and finally exercise their rights as Americans. And I hope I can help your understanding of the mechanics of elections. I served for 10 years as election commissioner in the Northern Mariana Islands. I was responsible for voter registration, absentee mail-in ballots, training election workers, securing ballots, and all the behind-the-scenes complications that produce a clean and credible election, free and fair. We're all concerned about how the coronavirus may impact the election process. To begin on a hopeful note, I will tell you that 1 week before the 2018 election, a super typhoon struck the Marianas, throwing life into chaos, cutting off power and water, stripping the roofs from the schools where we go to vote. The governor delayed the election by 1 week, and according to the Congressional Research Service, the only case of a postponed federal general election in modern history. Though people were still struggling to put their lives together, 1 week later, they voted, and turnout was good. The integrity of the election seems to have been maintained. The results were not questioned, not until later. If the people of the Marianas can hold an election even after the second worst typhoon in United States history, surely America can maintain this cornerstone of our democracy, even in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. I am hopeful based on the 2018 experience. I'm also hopeful because Congress has already acted with election security funding in the Consolidated Appropriations Act in December. The Marianas, for example, received $600,000 using that money. I understand to upgrade voting equipment, auditing, voter registration, strengthening cybersecurity, and better track campaign financing. That appropriation comes to the Marianas through the Help America Vote Act, which is particularly satisfying. In 2002, when I was election commissioner and the Help America Vote Act was enacted, the Marianas had no delegate in Congress and thus no federal election. So we were not included in HAVA. It has long been my goal to fix that gap and the Consolidated Appropriations deal. The Congress did not stop with just one appropriation. In March, we passed the CARES Act with more funding to ensure the November 3rd federal election goes on despite the coronavirus crisis. The Marianas Election Commission gets another $600,000 from the CARES Act to implement vote by mail and expand voter registration and early voting. The money can also increase the number of voting places to reduce crowding and keep in-person voters healthy. These actions do not mean we are finished. House Democrats' signature legislation, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, also aims to make voting easier and more secure, but the Senate has refused to take up our bill. The For the People Act permanently includes the Marianas in the Help America Vote Act. There is also a technical correction adding the Marianas to the National Voter Registration Act and protection from Marianas voters who use the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act to vote in presidential elections. And H.R. 1 establishes a commission to recommend how to provide full and equal voting rights here in the House of Representatives and in elections for president for the people of the Marianas and the other insular areas. So let us hope today's hearings reminds America there is more to be done to to improve and protect America's election and ensure every citizen has the right to representation and the right to vote. The House has acted. The Senate should do. Something's wrong here.
We can hear you, Keely Lee.
Yeah, I'm hearing something else. Oh, there. Okay. So lastly, I want to remind the subcommittee that there are technical corrections needed in federal election law to assure people in the non-state areas are protected from intimidation, threats, or coercion when they cast their ballots in federal elections. So in 2011, I introduced HR 3268, which makes all federal election laws fully applicable in the Marianas, American Samoa, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The bill bars government officials from using their authority to interfere with the nomination or election process. The bill bars non-citizens from voting and prohibits any false representations when registering or voting. Among the co-sponsors was our late and beloved John Lewis. I hope, Madam Chair, as part of our memorial to him, we take up these long overdue technical corrections in federal election law so everyone in the insular areas has all of the voting rights protections afforded the rest of the United States. I will certainly look forward to working with Chair Fox and the subcommittee to reach that legislative goal. I look forward to hearing Mr. Weir's testimony today as well. And I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Thank you. Ayo.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you to all of the witnesses. Certainly, I, for one, I'm with you. Just tell me what I need to do, and I will do the best I can to ensure that we do the right thing. So I appreciate your testimony. And before I go to the second panel, I need to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a written statement from former Congressman Robert Underwood, who represented Guam in the Congress from 1993 to 2003. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that statements be entered into the record from the National Disability Rights Network, Attorney Pamela Colon, Dr. Carlisle Corbin, Attorney Emil Henderson, the Virgin Islands GOP, and Carolyn Falk, Supervisor of Elections for the Virgin Islands. Without objection, so ordered. It is now time for our second panel. Gerard Emanuel is a retired educator, having worked most of his adult life as an educator in jobs that involved history, culture, political status, research, and/or public administration. Mr. Emanuel was a political status educator for the United States Virgin Islands Bureau of Public Administration, as well as the executive director for the Virgin Islands Commission on Status and Federal Relations, and a delegate to the Fifth Constitutional Convention. Gwen Marie Molinar is the president of the League of Women Voters of the Virgin Islands. Dr. Molinar is from St. Thomas. She has a PhD in neurophysiology and was a faculty member of the Howard University School of Medicine from 1972 to 1988 and became provost of the University of the Virgin Islands before retiring in 2005. Neil Ware is the president and founder of Equally American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Raised in the U.S. territory of Guam, Mr. Ware worked for Guam's former delegate Madeline Bordallo prior to attending law school. Mr. Ware is a civil rights attorney committed to achieving equal rights for Americans living in the U.S. territories. Mr. Emanuel, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Please unmute yourself.
Where is it?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Can I begin now?
Yes.
Yes. Good morning, Honorable Congresswoman Fudge and other honorable members of the House Administration Subcommittee on Elections. My name is Jerome. Thank you for inviting us to the important field hearing. I would also like to thank Congresswoman, the Honorable Stacey, for recommending me as a presenter. I will address voting on the national level. I concur with Dr. Carla Corb's statement to this subcommittee. Today, I hope to demonstrate that the basis of withholding rights from Virgin Islands, including voting on the national level, is fatally flawed and was never justified. The legal decision that denied us these voting rights may have been based on Jim views that were said before, that should never have been a foundation for making legal decisions. Honorable members, as a result, in unincorporated territories, as you know, the Constitution doesn't follow the flag, but constitutional experts such as Stanley Laughlin state that it should, except in cases where applying it is impractical, anomalous, violative of the local culture and customs. Granting the territories the right to vote for the commander-in-chief, as well as providing voting representation in both houses of Congress, would definitely not be impractical or violate any local or cultural custom. Doing this is a violation of our rights as U.S. citizens. The reasons for denying these rights were stated by Justice Brown in Dong versus Bidwell over 120 years ago. Furthermore, the court was unanimous in Balzac versus Puerto Rico in denying U.S. citizens their tri-jury solely because they reside in an unincorporated territory. These reasons might have seemed valid during the Jim Crow era, when segregation was based on Plessy versus Ferguson. They should not have been valid after the Brown v. Board of Education, and certainly not after Erie had proven that it could operate a government based on the laws and principles of the U.S. Constitution for more than half a century. Furthermore, denying U.S. citizens the right to vote in national elections simply because of their residence is out of step with the recent clamor for justice and equality, especially for persons of color after recent public events and the death of two civil rights. Honorable members, the Supreme Court invented the status of unincorporated territory, and it was never intended to be permanent, as said before. Justice White said this. This untenable and unconstitutional situation has lasted for over 100 years in the Virgin Islands. The remedy we seek Congress to consider that since we are too small to be a state like Puerto Rico, also since U.S. citizens in the territories have all the duties and responsibilities of citizenship, they should be granted certain rights that U.S. citizens who reside in states have. Denying us a vote for the present voting representation in Congress is anachronistic, anomalous, discriminatory, and must be changed because it is also inconsistent with the ideas upon which this country was built. All of us have paid the tax by fighting and dying in war by the U.S. We are also obligated to perform all of the responsibilities I said before. Isn't it fair that we obtain the rights of U.S. residing in the states while we reside in the Virgin Islands? Denying this to the territories is like taxation without representation. One of the fundamental reasons for the Revolutionary War. And as my congresswoman mentioned, we fought the Revolutionary War. Not only that, but Abraham, who created like aid. We fought in this war, Judah P. Benjamin, and died in all wars. So Congress people, in conclusion, it is made clear in Balzac versus Puerto Rico that it is the status of the territory itself, not the status of U.S. citizens there, that determine rights and privileges can be exercised. And an unincorporated territory is more than an international country. It's living abroad in almost for both members of Congress. They can receive SSI, but if they're fortunate to become a resident in the United States territory, please remedy this difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Emanuel. We were having just a little bit of difficulty with your sound, but we do have your written testimony as well. So thank you so much. Ms. Gwen Marie Molinar, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Am I heard now? Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee and honorable guests here today. Thank you so very much for this invitation to testify on voting rights in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It is disturbing that this great country of ours, which was founded on the ideal of government by, of, and for the people, is today struggling to uphold one of its founding principles, the democratic right of its citizens to vote. The League of Women Voters of the Virgin Islands notes that we are in the Virgin Islands free of some of the more heinous assaults against citizen rights to vote. I am pleased to report, for example, that we do not have gerrymandering, nor blatant purging of voter rolls, nor threats of fraud associated with mail-in voting. So within our territory, citizen voting rights are well protected when it comes to local government. I cannot predict that it will always remain so, but I do not foresee signs of any imminent change ahead. However, more could always be done for the physically challenged and physically disabled. On a parallel note, within the territories, there has been a strong push for the presidential vote. The League of Women Voters of the Virgin Islands has supported the efforts of Neil Ware in this regard, and we will continue to do so. But besides the presidential vote, however, we are concerned that our congressional representatives do not have a stable vote in Congress beyond the standing committee level. Congress has wrestled with this issue of the delegate vote since 1794. As our territorial representatives are not members of the House, they cannot vote on the House floor, but can do so in standing committees and only occasionally in the Committee of the Whole, depending on the majority control of the House. Generally, their vote in the whole is allowed under Democratic control, but not under Republican control of the House. What is the rationale there besides a partisan advantage? But this can easily be changed in House rules. The House has changed the rules and voting responsibilities of the delegates over the years from a simple presence in 1794 to now a vote in standing committees and an occasional vote in the Committee of the Whole. So change has and can continue to happen. Rules can change, and so can our Constitution. It is noteworthy that in some European countries, representatives from their Caribbean territories have full voting powers in the national voting assemblies. If our representatives have been found worthy over the years to be good enough for voting membership in standing committees and occasionally in the whole, why not within the Committee on the Whole on a regular basis, irrespective of partisan control? At a conference on territorial affairs held in Washington, D.C. in 1993, when asked about this, a U.S. congressman attending the conference stated that to allow territorial representatives that level of the vote would be tantamount to, and I quote him, it would be tantamount to a case of the tail wagging the dog, unquote. However, it needs to be pointed out that in that proverbial tail is the population of Puerto Rico, which outnumbers the population of at least 5 or 6 states. Unfettered, it is reminiscent of the old days of the plantation of the South, when the so-called lesser beings stood outside the House, not good enough to step inside. Why are the territories being treated like the lesser beings in US Congress standing outside? After all, we have fought in your wars shoulder to shoulder with other American soldiers, as has been pointed out by Professor Emanuel and our Congresswoman Plaskett. We've been fighting since we were purchased from Denmark in 1917. Also, the territories do contribute millions, if not billions collectively, through special taxes. Look at rum and our gasoline taxes. However, we recognize that these issues will remain problematic until we can clarify our federal relations, until we can determine our political status with the US. To do this well, we need to have adequate support and the necessary resources to make those decisions. Once done, these issues can be more easily resolved within that new context and through meaningful discussions and compromise with Congress on how we can have full inclusion as U.S. citizens in the U.S. territories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ware, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, distinguished committee members, and representatives of the territories. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of voting rights for the nearly 4 million Americans living in U.S. territories, 98% of whom are racial or ethnic minorities. I'm Neil Weir, president and founder of Equally American Legal Defense and Education Fund. I grew up in Guam, and when I turned 18, I was required to register for selective service, but was unable to vote for president. I founded Equally American in 2013, and it remains the only public interest law organization focused exclusively on advancing equality and voting rights in U.S. territories. Building on the progress of earlier civil rights movements, including the work of American heroes like John Lewis and Thurgood Marshall, we approach our work through a civil rights lens and do not take a position on political status. Using civil rights litigation, we work to build the kind of broad awareness and consensus at both the national and local level needed to end the second-class treatment of U.S. citizens in the territories. On Veterans Day in 2015, Equally American filed a federal voting rights lawsuit on behalf of Luis Segovia and other territorial residents who could have voted for president under overseas voting laws if they lived literally anywhere else in the world, even a foreign country. We also represented the League of Women Voters of the Virgin Islands, which Dr. Molinar leads. Luis and 3 other plaintiffs were decorated veterans who'd honorably served in the U.S. Armed Forces, swearing an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to obey the orders of the President of the United States. Yet, despite their service, they remain disenfranchised, unable to vote for their commander-in-chief. These decorated veterans deserve better, and their story is not unique. U.S. territories have a proud tradition of military service. Over 100,000 veterans live in the territories, having served to defend our nation's democratic and constitutional principles. Yet, they remain disenfranchised simply because of where they live. It is also clear that the right to vote must be viewed as a kitchen table issue, not simply a matter of principle. Residents of U.S. territories are shortchanged in a range of federal benefits programs that most Americans take for granted. Disparities in federal Medicaid policy leave citizens in the territories without the funding that ensures a basic level of healthcare sustainability in most American communities. Under federal law, otherwise eligible, low-income, aged, blind, or disabled Americans living in most territories are entirely precluded from receiving SSI benefits based solely on where they live. Some of these discriminatory federal laws have been recently struck down in federal courts and will likely soon come before the U.S. Supreme Court. But Congress need not and should not wait for the Supreme Court to say whether this kind of discrimination is unconstitutional for Congress to know it is wrong. The grim reality is until residents of the territories are able to vote for president and have voting representation in Congress, life and death decisions will continue to be made by the federal government without their input. Underlying the ongoing disenfranchisement and inequality facing U.S. citizens in the territories is the shameful legacy of the Insular cases, a series of controversial decisions grounded in overt racism, which for over a century have relegated those territories to second-class status. While other racist Supreme Court decisions like Plessy and Korematsu have been overruled, the Insular cases doctrine of separate and unequal is still in the books. Until the Insular cases are overruled, discrimination against residents of the territories is unlikely to end. We're working to do just that through groundbreaking civil rights legislation. One political obstacle to the expansion of voting rights in U.S. territories has been the perception that providing political representation to these Americans would benefit one party over the other. But voters in each of the territories consistently elect both Democrats and Republicans to represent them in all levels of government. In Puerto Rico, Congresswoman Gonzalez, of course, is a Republican, as is the current governor there, and even the president of their Senate, while their immediate predecessors were all Democrats. Voters in the other territories also elect both Republicans and Democrats. Misguided politics should not be an excuse for continued disenfranchisement. This ongoing disenfranchisement is particularly concerning because of the undeniable connection it has to issues of race. We cannot ignore the fact that by silencing citizens in the territories, we are silencing Americans who have long faced racism, systemic bias, and racial exclusion. We ask Congress to act so that citizens in the territories cannot vote for president and lack voting representation in Congress can finally have their voices heard. It is the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, and this year in 2020, it is long overdue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our witnesses. I so much appreciate your testimony. It is now time for members to ask questions. I would first recognize Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I have heard most of it. I'm in my Rayburn office, and I've been following your testimony as well as doing a few other things to make sure that I can ask you some informed questions. But let me just simply start first with the delegates, and thank you for your passion. I have watched each of you in your own space as you have advocated for your constituents, and I just want to thank you for your passion. And like the chair, I hope that I'm here long enough to see the day that you will have full voting rights in the Congress of the United States. But let me just ask the 4 delegates if I can do this very quickly. If you, and I'll talk slowly so you can kind of think of the 2 things that you could recommend. But if you would recommend 2 things that we can do to improve voting in the territories. 2 things. What would they be? Congresswoman Plaskett?
Thank you very much for the question. The first thing which has been done, and I believe now needs to be an actual creation, is an HR 1. I authored, and the other territories agreed with me on the creation of a congressional task force that would put into the record what have been the implications and the effects of not having voting rights in the territories, as well as to come up with recommendations for that inclusion to be presented to the Congress. I believe that should be done.
Thank you.
I think the other thing, the second one, would be to remove the barriers and the disparity in treatment of the territories in terms of funding so that we could grow our economies and our population to be able to come on par and move towards a more equitable position to demand either inclusion or independence.
Let me ask the gentlelady from Puerto Rico the same question. 2 things, 2 very basic things that we can and should do. Jennifer.
GK, I'm not sure she's still on the line with us.
All right, let me go to the representative from the Northern Mariana Islands, please. 2 things. Okay.
All right, no, thank you. Thank you for your question, Mr. Butterfield. I will agree with Delegate Stacy Plaskett that the passage of HR 1, the enactment of that bill into law would be extremely helpful. Having said that, I also would think that the provisions of HR 3268 will help move forward the exercise of free and fair elections in the territories, stating that elections in the territories should be held up to federal standards as well. Elections in the territories are intramural sports, Mr. Butterfield. Seriously, things get mixed up, and I'm the only Democrat in office for the past 12 years. Just imagine.
You're voting seriously on the island. Is that right? I mean, your constituents treat this thing very seriously. Yes.
Right. Participation is always in the, for most part, in the upper 80%. Unlike in our nation, which, it's in the hovers in the 50 or 60%.
Sure.
And of course, the passage, some of the success of Mr. Weir is also good for the territories. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Finally, to the gentleman from Guam, 2 things, 2 plain English, 2 basic things that we can and should do.
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I agree with my 2 colleagues, Congressman Plaskett on HR 1, as well as the legislation referenced by Congressman Sablan. As well, I would like to put on the record, as I mentioned in my testimony, HR 5526. Sir, as you know, if you have any issue that you want to have addressed in the Senate, you can walk over and talk to your representative in the Senate. Territories do not have that luxury. The challenge that comes with that is that territorial issues and concerns don't have a voice. And so when we have things like the CARES Act or the HEROES Act or even the HEALS Act, they're crafted without the perspective of territories when it's being managed and handled on the Senate side. And that inability for us to have even basic input is just so destructive to our ability to advocate for representation for our people. And as you see with us here today, just having even delegate representation is a huge step forward. And I think that getting that for our territories in the Senate is something that is an action step that we can do right now to increase representation.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. And you have my conditional, unqualified support, as well as the chair. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Davis, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. This is a great opportunity to hear about priorities. I'm glad Ms. Plaskett was advocating for a task force to have Congress look at the potential of changes for our territories. I'd support a provision like that. But let's not kid ourselves. Throwing that into a 600-page bill named HR 1 that was written before and co-sponsored by every member of the majority and announced the day of swearing in, people didn't have as much input in that bill. And there are so many bad things in that piece of legislation, like the first ever taxpayer funding to go to our own congressional campaigns. My constituents can't stand for that. And then after that was called out, it was changed to the first ever corporate money directly going to our own campaigns. So if we want to work together, then let's work together on this. But we have got to watch for what is happening right now in our territories or in our states, in our elections that have been recently held. Oh, almost a month ago, we had an election in New York City. We still don't have the results. So many of the provisions of election that dealt with elections were actually part of HR 1 and instituted in states like New York, and we don't even have the results. What are we doing to fix this? What are we doing to stop the fraud that happened in New Jersey? What are we doing to stop the fraud that happened in Indiana? No, we're going to put our head in the sand. All of the things that we found so wrong long before I was alive that stop people from being able to vote are happening in our country right now by closing polling locations, making sure that people will only use one certain type of process that's disenfranchising tens of thousands of people in our election authorities. That's wrong. So with that being said, Ms. Molinar, please tell us how you and the Virgin Islands are able to prepare for this pandemic, and what are you doing to stop what we've seen happen in other states already just a few weeks ago?
I indicated in my opening remarks in testimony that indeed in the Virgin Islands, we are free from all of the heinous assaults that we see happening nationwide, and we are all very much concerned that this is happening in the United States. We have a supervisor of elections, and I'm disappointed that she was not included in part of this discussion, but she would have been able to indicate to you that indeed there are rules and regulations and guidance that we are following that prevent all of that, and we have been free of that. As I indicated in my testimony, I can't promise we will continue to do so, but right now we don't have that. Our big concerns right now are, as we have all of the other witnesses have pointed out, we are very much concerned about the fact that we are not able to discuss in Congress on a full level with all other citizens through their representatives what our concerns are, what our needs are. And I'm so happy that that representative from Guam has also included the statement that we need also to have representative also in the Senate. This has to be changed. And I believe that I ask that you look at my last request in my statement that we do need to have the matter of status finally resolved within the territories. And we need to have the support that will allow us to make meaningful decisions on this matter. The Constitution has been changed, rules and committees in the House have been changed. We can change, and we must change.
Well, thank you, Ms. Molinar. I appreciate that. And again, I know a lot of discussion in opening testimony has been about having access to HAVA funds. That's
Yes.
something I think we can work together on in a bipartisan way. But at the same time, we also have to follow the law. What is the Virgin Islands doing to maintain their voter rolls?
Again, that is a good question that our supervisor for elections would have been able to answer. But I know that they have not had any difficulties with doing so. And we have not heard of any assaults against that. And I know that it is being done on a regular basis. I have spoken with the supervisor of elections on a number of issues, and she has indeed indicated that they do look at voter rolls and they are updated on a regular basis.
Great. Well, I see I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Aguilar, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you having this hearing. This is critically important to hear from our colleagues who represent the territories, as well as our guests who presented testimony. And I'm gonna start with them. Ms. Molinar, what do you feel most? I mean, you've talked about representation, just like Delegate San Nicolas mentioned as well. What do you feel most Americans need to know about physically voting in the territories? What is often overlooked and not understood? And I'll ask Ms. Molinar and then Mr. Emanuel and Mr. Weir. Ma'am, go ahead.
Well, I did most of my education on the mainland. And to tell you the truth, most Americans know very little about the territories. But when I do indicate that we did not have, when I was in school, we did not have a voting representative at any level, and that finally, when they do vote, the vote is considered inconsequential. They're not included as part of the quorum in the House, as if they're not there. People are stunned and are shocked. I think that the vast majority of Americans are completely unaware of the inequities that are thrown to our citizens in the territories. I think most Americans would be shocked to know that indeed these conditions exist. And those Americans from the mainland who do come to our territory come up to the rude awakening that they could not vote for the president until they flew back to the mainland, as if there was something tainted on the place of the territories. So it's becoming known. I think we need to let most Americans know. And I think if we did, there would be an upswell of individuals to support the claims that we are making in the territories, that we need to be given our full rights as citizens, because we are behaving like full citizens, going to war, paying taxes.
Thank you. Mr. Emanuel?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think you're asking what is it that citizens in the United States need to know about the problems we're having. I would align myself with Attorney Weir, because the Insular cases, the basis for the Insular cases no longer exists. They stated specifically that we didn't understand Anglo-Saxon principles, but people in the Virgin Islands have been in Denmark for hundreds of years, dealing with trial by jury, dealing with elections, etc., as Dr. Molina said. And also, another basis for the Insular cases was the nature of our senators. They didn't want to give district court judges lifetime tenure because I guess the unincorporated territorial status was temporary. But we've been there for over 103 years, so I don't know what temporary means in the American parlance. So my point that I think all Americans need to understand, and the Supreme Court, is that the legal basis, if there ever was one, the legal basis for having unincorporated territories no longer exists. So we should be able to move forward and provide all those formal parts of the Constitution, such as suffrage and all other things, to the citizens in the territories and to other U.S. citizens when they come there. That's basically what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Mr. Weir?
Yeah, I think most Americans are surprised to learn that there are U.S. citizens under the U.S. flag who are completely disenfranchised. One other thing a lot of people don't realize is just how many Americans live in the territories. So the population of the 5 populated territories is actually greater than the population of the 5 smallest states combined. The smallest states have 15 electors, 10 senators, 5 representatives in Congress, and the combined population of almost 4 million in the territories have none of those things. There's also a lot of people who are surprised and kind of assume that residents of territories would vote for one party over another. In Guam, for example, residents of Guam are swing voters. There's actually been a straw poll where, while they can't vote for president for real, each presidential election since 1980, they get a mark on a ballot who they would vote if they could vote. And between 1980 and 2012, Guam voters selected the eventual winner of the election a day ahead of the rest of the country because Guam's on the other side of the date line. So residents of territories are swing voters. This should not be a partisan issue. Every American should be able to vote wherever they live.
Thank you, Mr. Weir. I appreciate it. Thank you to our guests for being here. Mr. Davis made a point in his opening about the number of men and women who serve in our armed services who come from the territories. And on a per capita basis, the territories send more than Illinois, more than California, more than any state in our union. And I think most Americans need to start connecting those dots about the service to our country and the lack of representation that we have. I also want to say that I owe the chair a coffee, because this might be the first hearing, Madam Chair, that Mr. Davis hasn't mentioned ballot harvesting in California. So he's not
Ballot harvesting. Time's up.
He's not on message today, even though we know that the only voter fraud that happened in the last election was in North Carolina. But with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Loudermilk, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this today. It's a very interesting conversation, and I agree with Mr. Davis that this is something that a task force would be well advised to look into and study on a bipartisan basis. And I just briefly want to mention the ballot harvesting in California, because Mr. Davis refused to do that. So, but moving on, Mr. Ware, in your opinion, do the respective territories have the infrastructure and procedures in place to conduct a smooth federal election? For example, do the territories have the updated voting machines, cybersecurity protections, and bipartisan election observers to prevent against coercion and fraud?
I'm not an election administration expert, but I know, having voted in many federal elections myself in the territories, that they do follow the same practices, sometimes for better or worse, as the rest of the country have participated by absentee ballot while I was working for Congresswoman Bordallo. And I know that election administrators, such as Congressman Sablon was for many years, do the best they can with the local and federal resources to ensure elections, fair elections, are held every cycle.
With the influx of mail ballots that we've seen throughout the United States, do you think the territories are equipped to handle a potential massive influx of those? It's for Mr. Ware.
Sure. Again, not an expert on those issues, but I know that with the territories and how many people do travel abroad, absentee voting and voting by mail is a process that they're very familiar with, that they've supported, and that usually, particularly in the smaller territory, given the smaller number of voters involved, is not a process that is unmanageable, in my experience.
Well, thank you. And also open that question up to any of the delegates or any other guests.
May I?
Sure.
May I, Mr. Loudermilk? Thank you. I conducted elections in the Northern Marianas for 10 years. And yes, absentee voting, about 10%, a little bit over 10% of our population vote by absentee because they moved to the US for medical, for educational purposes. And actually, I had an experience where a Navy sailor who was in a submarine somewhere underwater actually wanted to vote, and we had to immediately, urgently put out a mechanism where he would allow us to expose his ballot because that he would know how it voted, and actually allowed him to vote. I don't know how they sent that transmission, but it came in by fax. And so yes, we are equipped to do that, and yeah, I think it'd be wonderful if, because right now you can actually, starting 10 days before the election, walk in for no reason and ask for a ballot so you could vote by mail, even if just because you're busy on election day. So yes, I think the territories are ready for mail-in ballots. That's my experience, sir.
My colleague, Mr. Loudermilk, this is Stacy Plaskett again. Just want you to know that under the CARES Act, the Virgin Islands Board of Elections, based on the written testimony of Carolyn Fawkes, received $600,000 for protective equipment and other resources to support elections during this time period of COVID. Additionally, the Board of Elections has extended the period for early voting, which we have been doing increasingly over each election cycle, extending the time for early voting, which allows people to be able to do that in a social distancing and have more time so that there's not a crowd at the end. And mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, the expansion of that for not having specific reasons or just as a request. There is discussion at the Board of Elections about allowing all ballots to be mailed. Those kinds of issues and initiatives are being debated and discussed now.
Thank you.
I see two hands up, Mr. Loudermilk. Do you want to continue or ask another question?
No, I'll just continue with these for the remaining time.
Ms. Molinar, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the question. I'm glad that Congressman Plaskett responded, because I was also going to mention that the League of Women Voters did indeed speak with our supervisor of elections, Ms. Fawkes, and she assured us that indeed the system is up for the mail-in ballots change. She indicated that mail-in voting has been in existence for quite a while in the U.S. Virgin Islands, because as it was pointed out by Mr. Ware, that many individuals have moved to the mainland, but they still maintain voting rights within the territory. So the system is accustomed to that. Ms. Fawkes also indicated that she is aware that the tradition of going to the polls is a very strong cultural one in the Virgin Islands. So although this is the increase in absentee ballots is a possibility, she recognizes that the system will definitely not be overwhelmed by an increase in absentee ballots. So the Virgin Islands definitely is prepared for this.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the congressman question also went to
Mr. Manuel, you're going to need to be
sorry.
very, very brief. The gentleman's time actually expired, but go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I wanted to say that we've also changed the machines. We used to have a Shuptronic machine. We have machines that meet HABA requirements. We have a paper trail, and we have a number of other measures in place to ensure the integrity of the elections. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Go back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Davis, do you have any closing statements or remarks?
Ballot harvesting is bad. Hey, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks to my colleagues, and very educational today. I certainly hope we can come together and work on some of these issues that were brought to our attention today. You have willing partners in the Republican conference, and I look forward to sitting down and discussing some of these in more details with each of my colleagues from the territory. So thanks again, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to all of the witnesses too.
I thank you all. Thank you so much. And let me just say a few words in closing. One, if my Republican colleagues would like for us to pull out the language that Ms. Plaskett has been talking about from HR1 and make it a standalone, I'd be happy to do that. If that's something that you guys want to co-sponsor with me, I'm happy to do it. Secondly, as we talked about how elections are run in the territories, it clearly has nothing to do with the status of voting for the President of the United States. My colleagues see something sinister around every single corner. But let me just say that status and your voting rights and the problems in New York have absolutely nothing to do with allowing the territories their full citizenship and their right to vote. I would now just want to thank all of the witnesses and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for these responses. I thank you all. Thank all of our witnesses for your testimony today. And without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Fudge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Wrap this up. What do I need to do now? Come on, right?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.